Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Support comes from the University of Alaska College Savings Plan, helping you and your child save for college every step of the way, from diapers to diploma. More information at uacollegesavings.com.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 26th of January. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information, weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. Give us a call on the weather info line or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube during the week and in between shows on Alaska Weather. Here's a look at what's going on with a focus on southeast to start us off tonight. We're going to see a lot of winds moving through southeast again. It looks like overall, though, the winds are going to be a little weaker than what we saw last night and into early this morning. We're expecting 40 to 50 mile an hour gusts along the outer coast with 60 mile an hour gusts across some of the southern inner channels and closer to the misty fjords and areas on the eastern side of the inner channels, probably 50 to 50 mile an hour gusts. So the core of those winds will be coming up over the Dixon entrance and moving into the southern third of southeast. On top of that, we're forcing more moisture up into the Haines and Skagway regions, including the Klondike Highway and the Haines Highway. As we get into Wednesday afternoon, there's going to be more snow, and as a result of that, could see up to another 7 inches or so, especially with higher amounts near the White Pass region, all as the frontal boundary is forcing a lot of wind and a lot of moisture to work its way up through the panhandle. Places like Prince of Wales could see some frequent gusts up to about 60 miles per hour as we get into late tonight and into early Wednesday morning. And again, the outer coast, looking at some stronger winds there up to about 40 to 55 miles per hour. Some of that again in the southern inner channels. Now, it's not just rain or it's not just snow and wind, but it's also rain. Here's a really zoomed in area of southeastern Alaska, and really got the whole view of the panhandle here. We're going to be talking about some heavy wet snow near the Klondike Highway, but for where it's not snowing, it is going to rain, and storm total rainfall here could exceed about 1.5 to about 2 inches or so around places like Gustavus and northward, and maybe a little bit southward toward Port Alexander. So you're going to get wet. It is going to be windy, and for some places it could snow an awful lot. This is round 2. Seas offshore again, approaching about 25 to 27 feet in some cases. So keep an eye on the weather. It's coming to southeast once again. No warnings, watches, or advisories as of this hour, though, for southeast. Make sure you've got your NOAA Weather Radio ready to go. And, of course, weather.gov/Juneau will have the very latest updates as they are needed. For the eastern Alaska range, wind advisory is still in effect there. Some gusts upwards of 55 miles per hour are expected in that region as we go into late tonight and early tomorrow morning. Don't be surprised to see some strong southerlies working through that area tonight and into tomorrow once again. For the eastern Beaufort Seacoast, blizzard warnings still in effect up there. It looks like that'll end around noon tomorrow before conditions improve. Easterlies gusting up to 55 miles an hour should be expected. That, of course, is blowing snow around and will likely lower visibility during the period. Many areas along the north coast saw some pretty strong gusts today, some of those upwards of 55 miles per hour. Looking around the Chukchi Seacoast from areas generally north of Kivalina is where the greatest issue is as we head into tonight and tomorrow. We're expecting probably some winter weather advisory type conditions, and that means blowing snow mostly. Gusty winds there coming out of the north, about 45 mile an hour winds there, probably dropping visibility to about a half mile or less at times. And generally, the worst of this will be north of Kivalina up toward Point Hope. And for the Chukchi Seacoast, especially around St. Lawrence Island, blizzard conditions are still possible there. We're looking at additional light accumulations of snow, about 2, 4, maybe 5 inches of snow on top of some very gusty north winds. And with that, we should see probably gusts upwards of 55 miles per hour. Those conditions may last as long as 6 p.m. tomorrow. So again, travel is discouraged when we have blizzard conditions like this. It's very easy to lose your way. Make sure you have a plan. Make sure someone knows where you're going. And make sure you check in with somebody when you get there just to make sure everything's okay, because it's very easy to get lost in poor visibility and driving snow like that. So blizzard conditions continue for the Chukchi Coast as well as areas around St. Lawrence Island until tomorrow afternoon and early evening. Here's a look at the bigger picture now, and once again the overall weather pattern really has not changed. Let's look at the Gulf. You can see the northward motion of low pressure waves, one right after the other. They just keep feeding up into the same old spots, and once again the next round is working its way into southeastern Alaska, constricting the wind and the moisture right up against the inner channels, and certainly some of the higher terrain there in the Wrangell-St. Elias region down toward the Haines and Klondike highways. And with that we get a great setup for lifted air, cooling air, all of it very wet, and it produces quite a bit of snow there. But in this case it also restricts that wind flow through those channeled terrain there, southeastern Alaska, so a perfect wind machine as well. And where none of that's happening, it's probably going to rain a lot. For South Central, you can see most of this is really just affecting the outer coast. It's been raining in Kodiak and many areas around Prince William Sound and the outer coast, Resurrection Bay, but a lot of this is not making it over the Chugach Range into places like Anchorage and Kenai and many areas down the Cook Inlet. Sure, you're getting the clouds and you're getting some occasional light rainfall, but most of it is considerably lighter than what we're seeing out across the coast. Pretty typical in this type of pattern. For the interior, we're getting a lot of clouds. We're not getting a whole lot of wind, but where the wind is sneaking through the passes, it is blustery. Places up toward Delta Junction and northward, you're getting those stronger gusts there of about 55 miles per hour. On the northern side of this entire weather pattern, we're pulling a lot of air across the northern coast and pushing it through the Bering Strait. With that, we're seeing those strong and gusty conditions and blowing the snow that is on the ground around and creating poor visibility. And in some cases it is snowing to add to the pain that is bringing blizzard conditions to places like St. Lawrence once again. On the not much is happening scale would be the Aleutians. You're seeing winds coming in from the west and northwest, still rounding this entire weather system. But generally speaking, it's a fair weather day. Not a whole lot of wind or gust to report there, except in maybe a few isolated cases, and not a whole lot of widespread precipitation either. The chance is there, but it's not very great. Here's a look at the weather map then. One front is working into the Yukon and British Columbia, 984 millibar low there, now into the Alcan border region and into the Copper River Basin. Rain was still moving through southeast, but at a little bit of a lesser intensity than what you saw overnight and early this morning. Here's the next wave. This will quickly move northward tonight. With that comes a resurgence of the wind and the rain and the snow up north. Again, no warnings or advisories out just yet. This does not look to be quite as intense as what we saw last night and tomorrow, but again, it will add a second punch to this. For South Central, if you've noticed the rainfall, sure, there's an opportunity. Some of that could be light freezing rain or freezing drizzle. It does not look to have considerable widespread impact, but it may be something that you notice if you're driving or moving around in the region. For the interior, partly to mostly cloudy sky. A little bit further north, the winds will be strong enough to start picking up some of that snow as you get north of the Brooks Range. From the Seward Peninsula westward, watch for some light snow and blowing snow at that, so blizzard conditions are possible there and expected. For the Pribilofs, expect snow showers there a little bit further south. Rain and snow showers may mix, and that trend could continue into southwestern Alaska as low pressure south of Kodiak Island. The whole system pretty much is on slow repeat. It looks like as we get into Wednesday, we've seen this before and we're going to see it again. Low pressure hovers south and east of Kodiak Island with the centers of those lows around 959 millibars. You can see that pressure gradient compacting and tightening up across southeast and the northern Gulf Coast. Breaks in the clouds as you move over the Alaska Range, and then stronger winds once again for the north coast as well as parts of the Bering. Watch for some higher seas out there. Chance for some snow showers and rain mixed with snow for the central and eastern Aleutians. Thursday, a little bit of a colder push dropping southward. Not a big one, but enough to put on the map with a cold front. A 967 millibar low there just east of the Pribilofs. That'll keep you in more of a northerly flow. Rain across the northern and eastern Gulf Coast. Again, the pressure gradient relaxes for parts of the Panhandle. Light snow is possible for the Copper River Basin. Breaks in the clouds across the interior and northward. And snow and blowing snow for the eastern and central Beaufort Seacoast there, as once again southerlies are becoming more easterly with time as you head northward. Temperature-wise today, back in the 40s for southeast. A strong southerly push at least brings you some added warmth with that wet weather. 30s and 40s for Prince William Sound, 31 in Anchorage, 39 in Homer today, 17 in Fairbanks, well above zero, and 9 above for Fort Yukon. Eagle was at 30 today after getting some reports of seeing the sunshine earlier this week. 25 around Arctic Village, 2 in Barrow. It was 6 above in Kaktovik, also mild. And single digits and teens for most of Kotzebue Sound. Kivalina at 10, 29 in Nome and Norton Sound. Unalakleet was 21 degrees. Around 8 above in Galena today. 15 for McGrath, 36 in Bethel, 30 in Nunivak Island around Macoriac, and upper 30s to 40 degrees for Kodiak Island. 30s and 40s for King Salmon and Dillingham, and about the same conditions there as we head down the Alaska Peninsula. Just shy of 40 this afternoon in Sand Point, 33 around St. Paul, and upper 20s and lower 30s for most of the central and western chain. Overnight low temperatures will hover close to 0 north of Fairbanks, but in Fairbanks in town anyway, at the airport closer to 16 degrees. 20s for most of south central, including Cook Inlet, 36 around Kodiak, upper 30s to mid 40s for southeast Ketchikan and Metlakatla. Fairly mild but windy again tonight. Single digits and teens for Kotzebue Sound. Barrow looking at 2 below. Prudhoe Bay a little bit colder at 6 below. The Yukon Kuskokwim Delta in places like Bethel all the way up to Amonuk. Lower to mid 20s should do the trick tonight. 33 in King Salmon and Dillingham, 29 in St. Paul, and overnight lows back in the central Aleutians, probably in the 20s, with highs tomorrow back in the lower 30s there. Southwest, you're looking at highs in the upper 20s and lower 30s, lower 40s as you get down toward Pilot Point and Port Hayden. 40s and 50s for southeast. South central, just a hair above freezing tomorrow. Talkeetna could be back in the mid 30s, maybe even upper 30s. Teens and 20s for the middle Tanana Valley. Eagle 27 and Barrow about 5 for your Wednesday. Now into flying weather. IFR conditions will be a little more improved as we go into tomorrow afternoon for the central Beaufort Seacoast and westward, but many areas will still be looking at some strong and gusty winds, so occasional dips below a half mile are certainly possible. And then into the Bering Strait, IFR conditions there expected with blizzards still in effect for St. Lawrence Island and the western parts of the Bering Seacoast there. As you get into the Kodiak Island and Prince William Sound region, pockets of IFR will become a little more widespread and then start to break up a little bit more as you head into southeast. But your pass conditions for the most part look okay. VFR conditions for Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass, Lake Clark and Merrill Pass expected to be VFR by the afternoon. Rainy Pass looking pretty good. Windy Pass looking VFR. Isabel Pass, we expect to see visual flight conditions there, as well as Mentasta Pass. Tanita Pass probably leaning over toward MVFR conditions through Wednesday afternoon. Portage Pass looks to move even further into IFR throughout the afternoon. And Chilkoot and White Pass we expect to remain marginal through at least most of the day. Freezing levels show that warmer air is still working northward toward Haida Gwaii. It's mainly over 2,000 to 4,000 feet for most areas in southeastern Alaska. Don't see a big surge out across the southern Bering Sea, but the surface freezing line holding fast at right about Nunivak Island and south of St. Matthew, still north of St. Paul, very close to the ice edge as you would imagine. Icing potential shows hit and miss, isolated moderate across the northern and eastern Gulf Coast and a large part of southeast. That's going to be up there, though, about 8,000 feet or higher, and above 6,000 feet for places like Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay, all the way up toward Bethel. Hit and miss out across the central Bering Sea, and then a little bit more widespread across the central and western Aleutians, also across the Chukchi Seacoast, above 5,000 feet there, and for the upper Yukon Valley as you head into western parts of Yukon itself. Here is the weather superhighway, the jet stream flowing at around 30,000 feet or so. You can see the wind speeds at 150 to 160 knots, and the position is critical to our weather pattern. And since it's south of Alaska right now, most of the weather, most of the bigger storms are leaving the North Pacific and moving right into the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast. However, some of that weather is breaking off and still traveling northward, and that's why all of our friends watching in southeastern Alaska today are still talking about the wind and waves and snow to come. That is how that system is finding its way to you. But most of Alaska, as you can see, is not really in the direct flow of that very active weather pattern. At 9,000 feet, as we look into the interior, you see wind speeds around 10 to about 20 knots or so, a little bit faster coming over the western Alaska range, and southerlies across the open waters of the Gulf running in around 40 to 50 knots. This is also helping to speed up the winds at the surface and create low-level wind shear and turbulence, as you would expect. Southeasterlies moving offshore for the eastern Beaufort Seacoast. And for the open waters of the Bering, wind speeds there around 20 to 25 knots. More of a north and westerly flow for the central and western chain at 3,000 feet. Stronger southerly winds are seen here south of Sitka, 50 to 60 knots or so. For southeast, you're looking at winds around 45 to 60 knots as they move into south central. For Kodiak Island, a broader easterly flow at 40 knots or so. And the interior sees a little bit faster flow at 20 to 45. Here's a look at turbulence then. As you would expect for the north and eastern Gulf Coast, at least occasional moderates possible below 4,000 feet. There could be some isolated cases for severe, so keep watch on what you're seeing and report your information as you have it there, pilots. We really appreciate that, and it makes a big difference. Below 4,000 feet for the Chukchi Seacoast and in through the Bering Strait, and watch for some occasional moderate north and west of the Kilbucks there below 4,000, and for the central and western chain tomorrow as well. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Convective activity is popping up, or maybe there's ice in the clouds, or low ceilings. Can you get through it safely, or should you be on the ground waiting out the weather? As an instrument-rated pilot, these are questions you've got to be able to answer. What about flying the route VFR? Does that seem out of the question on a day like today? With isolated cells developing, the see and avoid method of making sure you don't collide with a thunderstorm can work out. And it's perfectly legal, especially if, as an instrument pilot, you're prepared to get an IFR clearance if conditions require it. But filing IFR for an altitude that will keep you out of most of the clouds is even better. Now, with a forecast like this, some pilots would have scrubbed the mission before planning ever got this far. Making that call is part of what being PIC is all about. Make sure you know what's waiting at the other end of the flight, too. Review approaches before you leave the ground so you know what to expect. A 600-foot ceiling can be a piece of cake if there's an ILS, but a non-precision approach may result in a miss.
Okay, I filed via Martinsburg, then Victor 501 Phillipsburg, and Victor 265 Bradford Direct. So if we leave within the hour, we should be able to stay ahead of the weather. Or we can always deviate to the east if the weather develops sooner than forecast.
They have an ILS to runway 32 with minimums of 250 and half mile. And a VOR to 14, and that's 401 mile.
Yeah, so either way, we'll get a crosswind.
Yeah, that's the story of my life. Well, let's see. Cleveland Center handles the approach. You know, it looks like the airway is pretty much in alignment with the final approach course, so they should be able to give us a straight in.
Yeah, and if we're working weather, there's a DME arc to final there.
Uh-huh.
Being able to talk things over before the flight is one of the advantages of having a co-pilot. Discuss what-ifs and plan for ways to get out. It's a lot easier to think about it on the ground, and having determined your options makes you feel more comfortable in the air. Updating the plan in the air will help to keep you in the comfort zone. Even if you're flying alone, try to have this same kind of dialogue with yourself. Ask yourself why you selected a route or altitude or alternate. Where will you go if you have to divert only midway into your flight? One word of caution. If you're carrying passengers, it's best not to go through this dialogue out loud. They usually don't like the idea of flying with pilots who talk to themselves. It goes without saying, you need to know how to operate the avionics and other instrumentation you'll depend on during the flight. Yet if you fly IFR and don't know the capabilities and limitations of the air traffic control system, you're flying with instruments and equipment you don't know how to use. We'll highlight these capabilities and limitations during this flight. It's about 180 nautical from Dulles to Bradford by the route that they're plotting. A lot can happen in 180 miles, especially this time of the year.
Let's check for some alternates just in case.
Right, with good instrument approaches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's see. We've got Dubois, about 40 nautical south. It's got an ILS.
Mm-hmm.
Although with that weather to the west, we may need something more easterly. Oh, well, there's always University Park.
Ah, yes, your old alma mater, as I recall.
Roar, Lions, roar. And even further east, there's Williamsport.
Yeah, well, it looks like we're about ready to go then.
Almost. Now, what about weather updates along the route? Don't forget Bradford's non-towered.
Right, they have an ASOS.
Mm-hmm. And Cleveland Center controls their airspace, which means their radar may not show the nasty stuff we're trying to avoid.
You're right. We should plan on getting an update with Flight Watch before the descent. I'd say just after we switch to Cleveland Center, northwest of Phillipsburg.
Mm-hmm.
Not many pilots pay attention to these little blue zipper lines that zigzag across charts. They show which center controls the airspace. And not many pilots can tell you where an approach facility's radar coverage ends and a center's begins. What does it matter whose airspace you're flying in? When you're concerned about weather, it can make a big difference because of the capabilities and limitations of different ATC facilities, as we'll see. Is it approach control radar? Center? Is it an area of fringe coverage? Or practically right under a radome? All of that can matter when you're looking for precipitation.
Okay, I'll just check in with the office and then give flight service another call.
I'm going to supervise the fueling. I'll see you out there.
Okay.
We're going to follow their flight and see how they utilize the resources in the cockpit and here on the ground to deal with the weather.
Great. Thanks. See you next time. Hey, what's the word?
Okay, the forecast for Bradford's still calling for 5 miles in haze and a 30% probability of 600 feet and 1 mile visibility in thunderstorms for our arrival time.
The en route forecast still the same?
Yeah, unstable air is the main factor. Getting some radar echoes just east of Cleveland and also some near Youngstown.
Okay, well, we're going to definitely want to check in for weather updates along the way then. Now, you sure you're comfortable going in this stuff?
Oh, sure. We'll get some help from the ground, and if we don't like it, we can always turn around or divert.
Okay, well, let's get going, because the longer we wait, the higher the tops get.
Their beach debonair is equipped with basic IFR equipment. No storm avoidance gear. The fact is, the only electronic radar or storm avoidance equipment most GA pilots have is right here on the ground, ATC. And it has some definite limitations.
Clear, prop.
The stakes are high. From 1982 to 1993, adverse weather was involved in over 1/4 of all aviation accidents. The pilots were responsible for 94% of those accidents. These aren't the kind of mishaps people walk away from either. If you discount wind accidents, about 75% of weather-related accidents involve fatalities, and most occur from March through September. Here are some other facts about weather accidents to keep in mind. 60% of weather accidents involve pilots with less than 1,000 hours. And if you think an IFR ticket makes you invulnerable, 43% of the pilots in weather accidents had them. Of course, not all weather-related accidents involve IMC. High winds cause lots of bent metal, so does carburetor ice. But here's one final fact for VFR and IFR pilots alike to keep in mind. The #1 cause of all weather-related fatal accidents results from pilots' attempted or continued VFR flight into instrument meteorological conditions, and 27% are IFR rated.
Which is why we love to show you that flying weather map. Here's a look at the ice edge for today, and really not a whole lot has changed since yesterday, but we are still continuing to see growth to the south and west heading for St. Matthew Island. If you look really carefully, there's some hints of blue right there. There is more ice analyzed around St. Matthew today. And in Bristol Bay, not a whole lot of change expected in that region simply because low pressure keeps working northward, and many areas are going to see southerlies inside of Bristol Bay and across the Alaska Peninsula. We continue to see some growth across the northern parts of Cook Inlet as well. Anytime you want, weather.gov/Anchorage/ice.php for this chart, as well as the outlook for the next couple days and the long range outlook anytime. Here's a look at the marine forecast now for southeast. Strong and gusty winds, and in some cases storm force winds as you head into the Gulf of Alaska. Look for seas to run from about 25 to 26, maybe even 27 feet there from the south and southeast. Look for southeasterlies inside of the inner channels with, again, stronger winds across Clarence Strait and higher gusts in all areas. The Northern Canal looking at northerlies at 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Everything improves pretty much for Thursday. Winds settle down across the outer coast, 30 to 35. Seas looking at around 23 feet or so, 4 to 5 foot seas for most of the inner channels at winds from 20 to 25 knots for Thursday afternoon in southeast. Now for south central, north and easterly winds really starting to pick up speed as you head into the areas west of the Barrens, 40 to 55 knots there with seas coming up from 15 to 24 feet west of the Barrens. Southeasterlies coming into areas east of the Barrens at 40 knots with a 22-foot sea. And we're also looking at some pretty high winds outside of Prince William Sound up to 50 knots with a 25-foot sea there with higher gusts. And again, storm warnings are already in place for tonight, so be prepared. For Thursday, conditions improve quickly. North and westerlies across the northern Cook Inlet, and looking for north and easterlies south of Callaghan Island, westerlies for Shelikof Strait, and east of Kodiak Island, 35 knots with a 15-foot sea. South and easterly winds across the northern Gulf, 20 and 30 knots there with 17 to 21-foot seas, and easterlies down to 25 knots inside of Prince William Sound with a 6-foot sea. Northeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay for Wednesday. Look at the easterly flow here south of Castle Cape to Chignik at 30 knots, and northerlies a little bit further down the Bering Sea coast with an 8-foot sea. As we get into Thursday, there's the southerlies coming right back, and that's why it's going to make it a little bit harder for that ice to grow, at least across the southwestern coastline there in this general vicinity. Elsewhere, it's doing just fine with stronger north and easterly winds. Look for seas in the Bering at 7 to 9 feet and 16 to 18-foot seas there from Castle Cape all the way down toward False Pass there as we look at Thursday. For the Aleutians, a broad west and northwesterly flow for most of the chain. 25 knots in the east, 30 knots in the central regions, and more of a northwesterly flow in the west. 13-foot seas as you head out toward Kiska and Attu. By Thursday, really not much of a change. A slower speed there between Nikolsky and Atka, about 15 knots from the south and west. Otherwise, 25 to 35 should do the trick, with seas ranging from 11 feet in the east, 16 feet south of Adak to Nikolsky, and 11 to 14 feet out in the west as you look at Thursday afternoon. For the west coast, north and easterlies, 35 to 40. Looking at ice now north of Macoriac and Nunivak Island, 30 to 40 knots from St. Matthew all the way out toward the Kuskokwim Bay, and more of a variable flow as we were talking about yesterday around St. Paul and St. George with a 6-foot sea. Stronger north and easterly winds start to take over a little bit more on Thursday. You can see northerlies coming into the Pribilofs, southerlies inside of Kuskokwim Bay at 25 knots with an 8-foot sea. Stronger easterlies for the Beaufort Seacoast. Remember, blizzard conditions are in effect there, and northerlies also working through the Chukchi Sea. 20 to 30 knots there, creating blizzard conditions even further south. Not much of a change for Thursday. 20 to 30 knots there across the northern coast, 25 to 30 across the northwestern coast in the Chukchi Sea. Looking at Thursday afternoon. A recap of tonight's weather. Ready for a repeat in southeast. More wind, rain, and snow is coming your way. The good news is it should not be as intense as it was last night and earlier this morning. The bad news is if you don't want more snow around White Pass, then you better dust off your shovel either way. Gusty winds will be the predominant feature for many in the inner channels, as well as rain, snow for higher terrain there, and again some gusty winds are expected. Look for periods of rain and snow showers around south central and Cook Inlet. More to come there, but most of the active weather along the Gulf Coast and across the North Slope with blizzard conditions for St. Lawrence Island. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.